Matthew Alford, a teaching fellow at the University of Bath, is known for examining the censored television and film scripts of the United States, even searching the archives for his book, Real Power, Hollywood Cinema and American Supremacy. But in his latest book, Union Jackboot, What Your Media and Professors Don't Tell You About British Foreign Policy, he examines what we don't learn in school. Alfred interviews TJ Coles, the author of Britain's Secret Wars, about Britain's role in the age of Brexit, Trump, and Russia. Watching the Hawk's Own, Sean Stone sat down with Matthew Alford in London to learn more.
It is assumed, quite rightly, that British power, British Empire decreased markedly, both due to the First World War and certainly by the end of the Second World War, and that it was a shadow of its former self. By 1956, the Suez Crisis showed that Britain could no longer be a great power on the world stage, and the United States had taken its place in that regard very clearly. But nevertheless, if we look at the nature of British power now and its continued reach, particularly through the work of my colleague Tim Coles, who I'm kind of representing really today, Britain's role is still really significant. It's still a member of the G7, it's still a member of the UN Security permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's still, as well, in terms of the nefarious activity, it is still one of the world's largest arms dealers, for example. But then in addition to that, part of what Tim Coles' work has discovered is that British involvement as a military force in terms of training, arming, supplying, and in other ways assisting dictatorships and rather unpleasant insurgencies around the world is much greater than anyone had previously, much greater than people have put together.
Right.
And Tim has mainly done this through looking at very, very boring government documents that no one else can be bothered to read. Sure. To find that British military involvement exists in places like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Papua and Oman, and of course other slightly more obvious places like Saudi Arabia. But if you were to ask most people where is Britain in the world, where is Britain involved militarily, they would probably say Afghanistan, and they might say Iraq. And as I say in the book, didn't we leave Iraq anyway? And of course, you know, there's still huge military bases there and a huge military presence.
Well, you're mentioning countries that were all part of the empire. And certainly from my studies, the British basically by the end of the 19th century realized that they were overextended militarily. It was like Vietnam for America. They realized that we cannot enforce the empire with troops around the world, but we have to basically create a commonwealth of economics and governmental linkages under the Queen, ultimately the auspices of the Queen, value systems, things like this. So what is it that the military is doing, though, in countries you mentioned like Papua and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh? What is it the British are actually looking to achieve?
Well, sometimes it can be fairly benign. I lived for a few weeks in Belize several years ago, which is a British protectorate. I mean, Belize is a poor country, but it's not. I don't think that Britain is doing anything kind of cruel or evil there as part of its relationship. But sometimes it can be really dangerous. So, for example, in Nigeria, where Britain is involved, basically with Nigeria, largely to support Shell oil, and this is causing massive pollution. It's had fairly direct impacts on human rights abuses as well. In places like Sri Lanka, where we've supported the repressive government there against the Tamil, for example, which has led to war, arguably even genocide. And this is not to say that Britain has sole responsibility, but there's partial responsibility there, and it's often not known because it's kind of swept under the carpet by the British media.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly there's the aspect of the British media, also the feeling that these countries are not that important, obviously, when it comes to what the media focuses its attention.
They might be important, though, in terms of British investment. So some of the material that we've been looking at in this book is, for example, quite academic books that are basically rationalizing British foreign policy and saying, for example, that capitalism and poverty, that poverty might be an important phase in the development of capitalism, for example, and some of these books are kind of like ideological guides, really, created by some of the kind of Oxbridge-type academics, and that work is funded by some major companies in Britain. I won't name the companies because it would be annoying if you have to chop it out, but they're well-known high street because they're involved in the desire to create environments of investment in places like Sri Lanka. They want stable countries,
right,
basically, which are on our side, so that there is no kickback from the people. And they, of course, want to make very, very low wages, sweatshop labor. These things don't happen by chance. They are created by those systems and justified by those kind of academics.
Precisely. Policies that are implemented by governments originate really within the academic spheres,
yeah,
oftentimes with intelligence agencies and banking factions sort of feeding the right intelligence and information to the politicians to get the agenda that they want across.
Yeah.
And we saw with Iraq, certainly there was the British Niger documents that really were the smoking gun.
Oh yeah, the yellow cake. Yeah.
Exactly, about the nuclear capacity of Iraq that was facilitated by Britain. So Britain has consistently played a major role, especially with American policy. When we come to this new Cold War vis-a-vis Russia,
yeah.
It strikes me that Britain is really the ancient enemy of Russia, going back over 100 years to the Great Game. How much are we looking at a British hand in the new formulation of having pitting basically Russia against the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I think as with everything, the United States is leading, although there are certain countries that Britain is involved with, for example, the Falklands Islands and Gibraltar and these kind of nations that Britain is taking more of an active lead in. But the United States, of course, leads on the issue of Russia. But I mean, Britain's still got thousands of troops based in Germany in the same way that the United States has got many thousands still there. And this is part of an apparent bulwark against Russia, which seems quite a crazy. And it seems so strange, of course, to say it on RT, but it is also obvious. It just seems crazy to see Russia as such a significant threat. I mean, I just can't really understand why that would be.
I'm thinking of, for example, the Steele documents that came out of, frankly, not only England, but frankly, a former intelligence operative who's basically, feeding information and sort of trying to sway the opinion that the Russians are in bed with Trump. Right?
Yeah,
there seem to be some more layers deeper than simply a military presence of the British on the Russian border because of NATO.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a propaganda war going on here, isn't there? And it just, I mean, the big concern is whether that blows up into something bigger, and we hope to God that it doesn't. I mean, I don't really know. I'm not quite sure what will happen there. There seem to be legitimate reasons for tension between Britain and Russia, but I mean, I'm not an expert on that particular area. I think one of the things I was going to say is that the way that this book came about, which is called, I literally feel slightly shameless in my promotion here, but the book that I've just done is called Union Jackboot, but I'm not the primary author of that. Basically, I've found, I came across quite a peculiar academic who asked me basically to represent him because he doesn't really like going out of the house or talking to the media. And he's called Tim Coles, and he is obsessive and brilliant at breaking down these tedious government documents and academic rationales for often quite unpleasant British foreign policy. And he asked me if I could be part of not just promoting that, but actually making that book a kind of an accessible piece of work. So really, he's the expert there. British foreign policy isn't my primary area. It's just something I'm very interested in because I'm British. And I don't always want to be just bashing the Americans all the time, frankly,
right.
Because as Tim says, actually, we've got responsibility for our country. Americans have got responsibility for theirs. And it's all too easy for us as kind of liberal or left-wing Brits to say, oh yeah, it's all the Americans' fault, or oh, it's the Israelis who are doing that. Well, actually, no. A lot of the time it's Britain that is doing bad things. We are causing however many deaths around the world, and there are things that we could do about that through exposing it through the media and just not tolerating the lies and half-truths and psychopathic justifications of policy planners.
So what would the major regions of British interest, would it still encompass the entire world? Or are we looking at, we mentioned previously countries like Nigeria, which was more oil-oriented, Sri Lanka, Papua. I'm not sure what natural resources would be of interest for the British there, but basically we're talking about a global reach when it comes to the British Empire, or is it focused on certain countries and certain regions?
I mean, I think it's important to say that that Britain does have this global reach, but this is often just a relatively small number of troops that are going in to train. So in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, I mean, you haven't got hundreds or let alone thousands of British troops in there, but you've got fairly small numbers of people, SAS and so on, which are going in to make some kind of decisive difference. Now, Tim has been criticised in his work before by people saying, well, that doesn't really matter then, does it? Because the Americans are doing it 1,000 times worse. Well, yeah, that is true. But actually, if we're still contributing to that and we are citizens of our country, we should do something about that. Just in the same way that if Russia's doing something wrong, Russian citizens should do something about that, and Australians to the Australian government and so on. It's just a basic principle. And that's why we thought that it was important to do this.